So much. I'm here to introduce Dr. Eva Fernandez. She is the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Mercy College. She joined us just in 2022, so it's still on the new side, although it's been a couple of years. And previously, she was at the City University of New York, where she served in roles including Professor and Associate Provost for Innovation and Student Success at Queens College. So her interest in how people learn and use languages led to majors in linguistics and German at New York University, and to graduate work she completed in linguistics at the CUNY Graduate Center. She published one of her early books, Fundamentals in Psycholinguistics, in 2010, more recently collaborating on the Handbook of Psycholinguistics and perhaps another book, which I may not have the title, but I'm sure she'll be willing to share with us. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. Eva Fernandez.
I appreciate it. Let's make sure that people online can see the slides and people in the classroom also. And the QR code or the link is there for you if you want to look at the slides later. It'll be also shown at the end of the slideshow, in case you want them. You want the slides for forever. You wouldn't. Anyway, so thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. So a couple of things. I'm an administrator at the university, right? I'm the provost. That means that I oversee all of academic affairs. And one of the saddest parts of my job, I would say two parts, is that I hardly ever get to hang out with students. So love my colleagues help in changing that. And I never get to teach. So I'm butterflies all over the place. And I'm excited to share a little bit of some of the stuff that I used to teach back at Queens College, now so many years ago. And in talking with Dr. Nunez, what to present, I mean, I understand that a lot of the people in the audience are teachers or going to be teachers. You're working in a multilingual classroom, perhaps, right? Raise your hand if your classroom is multilingual. Okay, but raise your hand if you use language in your classroom. All the hands should be up, right? Don't be shy. It's okay. So today it's a little bit about linguistics, a little bit about psycholinguistics. We're going to talk a little bit about bilingualism, and let's see how it goes. I thought that we'd start with some definitions. Linguistics is the study of language, and really three things fall under that. One is the study of the formal properties of language, the vocabulary and the grammar, right? The lexicon and the grammar. We also study in linguistics how people learn language. Professor Nunez already mentioned that I have interests in acquisition, although not as much expertise as I do in the last thing, which is psycholinguistics. So how do people use language? Very important. It's not about, I enter a room sometimes and say I'm a linguist and people say, oh, I should watch how I speak, right? No, not at all, not at all. In fact, I'm excited to hear non-standard varieties, right? Speak in novel ways. Please, I'm interested. I want to study that. So linguistics is not about language policing. It's really about understanding what are both the formal properties and the psychological mechanisms that underpin language, and also a lot of other things like the societal mechanisms that also support language use and are adjacent to it. So I think that the Zoom people are right smack in the middle of some of my text. So on the left side is a formal definition of language from the perspective of linguists. And I want to stress that language is not the ideas, it's not the signals, and it's also not the communication, right? So it's different than that. So this language that linguists study is a formal system that is used to pair signals and meanings, okay? And it consists of some really formal things, a lexicon, so a vocabulary, which is, notice it's a finite set of words that's in your head, and also a finite set of rules in your head, rules about how to put sounds together, how to put pieces of words together, how to put pieces of sentences together to make bigger sentences, and how to put pieces of meaning together to make bigger pieces of meaning. I understand that some of you have had tiny little bits of linguistics in your studies, right? So some of this is probably not entirely foreign, but I understand if it's the first time you've thought about this, that it might be, it's complicated stuff if you've never studied it. Now, notice both of these things are finite sets of stuff you know, but they give you what linguists say is an incredible, super powerful creativity. We'll come back to that idea a little bit later on, so hold on to that thought. I figured that we would also talk a little bit on this slide about what communication is to distinguish it a little bit from language. Notice here we're talking very much very formal aspects of language. I'll show you some examples in the next slide of the rules that govern these different pockets of grammar. But on the other side is what governs successful transmission of ideas. And there, some examples are, I love this graphic and I wish I could remember where I found it so I could properly attribute it. But the idea is that communication is really about changing the mental state of the person who's in front of you, right? My job today will be okay if I manage to get you thinking differently about language. Okay, so notice that's like mind melding. That's like really like superpower kind of stuff that we do every day, which I think is super interesting. Pragmatic principles govern communication, and I'll show you some examples of what we mean in linguistics when we talk about principles that govern, I guess, good versus bad communication. Okay, and moving on to show you some examples. Let's see, did that not work? There we go. So again, grammar on the left, pragmatics on the right. In grammar, we talk about ungrammaticality when something violates a grammatical rule. And in pragmatics, people talk about infelicity when some communication interaction has been violated. And this is something that Dr. Nunez and I have been talking about a tiny little bit. Linguists actually learn a lot from people's errors, right? Or from examples that violate things that you ordinarily do with language. So we're going to see a bunch of, things that are weird, either ungrammatical or infelicitous, and they're kind of a little bit different each one. So starting with the phonological example at the very top, if I tell you we're going to call the new CRM, the new content, I don't even know what CRM stands for. It's a word we use a lot at Mercy, and it's terrible. I don't know the TLA, but we're going to call this thing a tlini. Would we ever call it a tlini? Why not? Sounds like food. It sounds awful, right? Like that violates the phonology of English, right? In Nahuatl, though, a language in Mexico, that's a perfectly fine word. Does anybody in this room speak Nahuatl? Okay, very not all that rare, but so in a different language it might be okay. In English, the phonology forbids this word. Look at the next one. The government of a small nation. What do you think about the word government? And contrast it to the word let's see, let me get it right. Governmenting. Which one is better? Government? Neither is a real word, right? But like government is really bad, whereas governmenting is okay, right? That's because your morphology tells you there's something about different kinds of morphemes and the order that you can put them on words that really matters. There's a rule in your head that tells you that that's a violation and some other version may not. I don't want to talk about this example, though if you're interested, we can talk about it later. Look at that sentence that was uttered by a former US president of the United States. The illiteracy of our children are appalling. That's a subject-verb agreement, right? And something in your syntax tells you the subject is singular, verb is plural, there's a problem there. A couple more examples on the semantic side. And, if you've ever heard about Chomsky, you might have heard this sentence. And if you haven't heard about who Chomsky is, it doesn't matter. But notice that crazy sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Perfect sentence as far as phonology, morphology, syntax, but when you start thinking about the meaning, what do you mean colorless and green? If you're green, you've got color. You can't be colorless, right? That's a semantic violation. The examples on the right are about communication and, things that we say that are kind of funny. They're not necessarily ungrammatical, but they violate principles like you say things, say them in the right order. It died and was hit by lightning. It was the other way around, right? So I know that I haven't been at Mercy so long, but at Queens College, I used to have a friend when a student would ask him, do you know where Kylie Hall is? He would say yes, and he would keep going, which is a terrible violation, right? The student is asking, please help me get to this place, right? So the next time somebody asks you this and you want to play with their communicative kind of competence, you can do something like this. If you ask me, do you have children? And I say, I have a dog named Odysseus, which I do, I'm not lying, but I'm omitting the fact that I have two human children. And I think that you're really asking me about them, not about my dog. Lastly, like we don't lie, right? Except when you're speeding, maybe, I don't know. All right. So this is a sketch of, so now we've talked a little bit about grammar and about pragmatics, about those things that you know, but then when using language in real time, you're actually putting to use using psycholinguistic mechanisms. That's the stuff that I've studied most of my adult career in various labs with various collaborators. The idea is, remember that language thing is connecting ideas and signals, right? Well, in order to get those ideas and signals to connect with each other, a speaker and a hearer have to either articulate or take in the signal, right? And so psycholinguists study all of these various steps, right? From the idea that then is turned into a selection of words that you then put together into a sentence that then is converted into a representation of sounds that you then can utter, say out loud. This is supposed to be a speech wave in case you don't know what that means. And then the speech wave hits the hearer's ear, and that person then grabs phonological information from the sound wave, identifies the words, puts them together into a representation that's syntactic, and then makes sense of the sentence. And there's a quote there. I'm not going to read it out loud, but when I read that quote, I was like, wow, this kind of sounds like the crazy implicit stuff that you're not aware that you're doing this, right? But every time you're listening to a sentence or saying a sentence, there's a whole lot of interesting and very intricate things that are going on in your head to either decode or encode the message. All right? I figured that I'd give you a couple of examples. I know that a lot of you are interested at the word in word level things. Dr. Nunez tells me so, so I believe her. But I want to argue that the sentence is a very interesting space for you to think about in terms of understanding how language works. Because in fact, we almost never use words in isolation. It's almost always words as sentences, right? And so one thing that I used to do with my students is when we were introducing the notion of, in this previous slide, when you're listening to a sentence, you retrieve the words, you make a syntactic representation. And in the following two examples, I'm going to hopefully convince you that that stuff is really real. That if you don't do syntactic calculations, you can't get at the idea. You can't decode a sentence. Are you ready for this demonstration? It's actually kind of cool. I miss doing this. I really do. So this is a very old technique developed in the 1970s when people had very different computers than today. It's called the RSVP paradigm, rapid serial visual presentation. You present words in very rapid order, one after the other. You ask people to recall them, okay? So I'm going to ask you, pay close attention to the screen, because you're going to have to remember the words that are on the screen. You ready? Okay. Right, write it down. Those of you online too.
Are you allowed to do it?
Yes. Because you weren't ready?
Well,
All right, you ready?
also, you know what, you're standing in front of the screen for those who,
I'm
or
sorry.
you can stand in the.
All right, we're gonna do it again. You ready? Yes?
Yes.
All right, excellent. All right. Oh, I pushed the wrong button. How many of you got it right?
I couldn't remember the last
What about the people online? I see only one hand. Okay. Yeah, all right. Yeah. I think the people in person are beating the people online.
one.
All right, I see more hands. Excellent. You ready for the next one?
Yes.
All right, let's go. Challenge.
What happened?
I'm lost.
We need to do it again?
Yeah.
I'm not writing it. Oh, no.
I see. So there's somebody in the front row shaking her head. Why? Why are you shaking your head? You're not even trying, right? But why do you think that is? It doesn't make sense, right? So the first example, almost everybody got it right, you know? It was easy. You probably also didn't have to pay a whole lot of attention. And imagine if I were to play the sentence even much faster at 250 milliseconds per word, you'd probably do just fine. But with this one, it's an unordered set of words. You can't calculate the syntactic tree. You can't make sense of what's the subject, what's the verb, what's the object. And so it's really hard to remember that string. So that's a nice demonstration that, oh my gosh, there's this thing going on whenever you're decoding words in context with each other, where you're calculating the syntactic representation. Because when you don't have it, the thing crashes, right? Your brain goes, I can't compute this sentence. I hope that you're a little bit convinced that there is some psycholinguistic reality than to syntax. Did you have your hand up or no? Okay, yes.
No, I was just wondering if I got it right.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot. How many of you got it right?
The first one, yes. The
The
second,
first one, yes. How about this one?
I couldn't compute it. And just,
You couldn't compute it, exactly.
this is not.
Excellent. Yes?
Will we have access to this
Yes.
PowerPoint after?
Yes, okay, absolutely.
I
I'll throw
tried
you-
the Q&R code, but it's not giving me the slides.
All right, well, I think the bit.ly link definitely works because I used it for the computer here. So we'll show it at the end.
Okay.
Yeah, isn't this fun? Psycholinguistics is so
I like
interesting.
that.
And in fact, you know, sentences, they are super interesting, I want to argue. In fact, again, I said it before, sentences, it's how usually you encounter words, right? And so understanding something about how sentences work kind of gives you insight to the superpowers that we have as users of language. So two examples of from simple to complex sentences on the left and on the right. And remember how before I said that this finite lexicon, right? A set of words in your head and a set of rules about how to put them together gives you this powerful creativity. And when linguists say that, they mean that you can utter and understand sentences that you've never heard before or said before, right? And part of the reason that you can do this is this notion of recursion. Have any of you ever heard this term before? Recursion. It's like nesting things inside each other, right? So notice the example first on the left. I make tools. You know, I had forgotten about your Asimov quote, but here's the connection. So I make tools. That's a simple sentence. But now we start getting complex. We take another sentence and put it inside that sentence because of this recursive property that English has, that you can take a little sentence and put it inside the bigger sentence, okay? So I make tools that make tools. I can also say, I make tools that monitor code, that deploys tools, that build tools for deploying monitors, for monitoring deployment of tools, for blah, I could go on and on and on, right? And some of you are shaking your head and say, I mean, I would never say that, although I have to say, when my children were little, they say sentences like that all the time, right? Just stringing things. And notice that that's actually a pretty easy sentence to process, right? But let's look at the one on the other side. And let's see if you have the same intuition. Penguin chick died, simple sentence. Now we're going to take another sentence that was hand reared by zookeepers in Devon and stick it inside that smaller sentence. And we're gonna do it again. Let's read them together, right? Penguin chick died, that's easy. Penguin chick that was hand reared by zookeepers in Devon died. It's okay, but it's kind of hard, right? Maybe it's the length, but look at this one. A penguin chick that was hand reared by zookeepers in Devon who used a puppet to impersonate an adult dies. Oh my gosh, that is such a hard sentence to process. So notice this recursion idea, which the rules of syntax say you can do. And in fact, we could continue. The syntax of English allows you to continue to add more and more little baby sentences inside this basic sentence. But it's kind of like you can't cope processing those sentences when it's like this, where the piece that you're putting is embedded in the center of the sentence as opposed to at the end. All right. So I think that stuff like this makes studying syntax and how it's processed super, super interesting. And it helps us understand, well, what are the limitations of language processing in our brains? You know, you've come across many sentences in your life where you're like, what was that? I did not understand it, right? And a lot of it has to do with sort of the mechanics of you applying your knowledge of language, right? Now we're going to move to a slightly different sort of conversation, which is, you know, when people started studying psycholinguistics, and actually linguistics in general, most of them were native speakers of English and monolingual. And so they really didn't care about things like, well, what about people like me, like Dr. Nunez, like so many people in this room who speak multiple languages, right? And I thought that I'd show you this fabulous map or this fabulous graphic that shows that in the United States, I actually got to this country in 1979. And I was like, my family was the only family in town who spoke Spanish, except for the Spanish teacher and a family from Cuba, right? But now the bilingual population has really, you know, expanded, especially in places like the community around Mercy University, right? So in fact, actually by show of hands, how many of you are bilingual? That's awesome, I love this. Yes, yay. So it behooves us, I think, if we're interested in understanding how language works, we need to understand how language works in bilinguals, because some places actually the bilinguals are the norm instead of the exception, right? And wouldn't it be amazing if we could, you know, perseverate that even more? So now, using language when you're bilingual from a psycholinguistic perspective, there's a bunch of things that bilinguals can do that monolinguals can't necessarily. One is speaking in a single code way, right? That is taking your other language and sort of keeping it in your back pocket. I've been doing that since I stepped into the room, right? I don't think I've said any word in Spanish. I will in a moment, but I can speak in unilingual mode, right? Sometimes it's harder, but usually it's easy. Also, code switching and code mixing and borrowing. Take a look at this amazing example. I just love this example. This is from this fabulous work, people who built up a corpus of code switching language in Spanish English bilinguals, I think mostly in the southwest of the US. So Miguel says, cuando estoy con mexicanos o algo que son México, como que entonces quiero hablar es inglés, como que me sale más easy. Right? He can just go like that. And then I love the second part. In inglés, when I'm speaking, hay veces que quiero poner una Spanish word in there. That incredible, and notice that he switches in the word Spanish, right? Oh my gosh, so interesting. Turns out that people who code switch more are people who have more proficiency in both of their languages. If one of your languages is a little bit more kind of iffy, because you're a new speaker of English, you code switch less. And you might have experienced that in your own bilingual sort of experiences. Sorry, that was so redundant, but Another thing that bilinguals do is native interpreting and native translating, right? I remember it would drive me crazy when my mother made me do this, right? You've all been there, or maybe you have, I don't know. But it's interesting that without necessarily training, you can figure out how to operate as the translator. And think about the kind of power that gives you. I know that it gave me the power to prevent my mother from knowing exactly what was going on, right? You've been there. But it also gives you this interesting power of you're working with the two languages. And one of the things that winds up happening, and we'll talk about that in a bit, is that maybe you get better at juggling transition from one code to the other. It gives you more metalinguistic ability. Have any of you ever heard that term, metalinguistics? So metalinguistic ability is the ability to think about language as a formal object, the ability to go meta with your language, to say things like, well, those two words mean the same thing, or those two words sound the same, but they mean different things. So bilinguals are actually going to be better at that. And perhaps it's because of some of these experiences that they have that require them to use both languages from one to the other, from the one to the other, etc. And the last one, I mean, bilinguals have sharp intuitions about grammaticality in each of their languages. And they know how to separate the two languages as well as put them together, as well as have intuitions about the grammaticality of mixed language, which is also super interesting. I wanted to give you some examples of mixing languages, and Dr. Nunez, how am I doing with time? I'm okay so far, right? Great. This one happens to have some audio examples, but when I was testing it, the audio didn't work. Maybe we stick around later and we listen to the examples, but let me go through the examples anyway, and I can describe the audio, all right? So when I'm actually very interested in what happens when people mix languages. And in fact, some of the most recent work that I've done, which now goes back to 2017, it feels so long ago that I've done anything in linguistics, but has been on the topic of innovations. You might have read about interference in your textbooks. You might have read about transfer. I think that the more kind of interesting way to think about this is that bilinguals have this great repertoire, two languages in your same head, that you can come up with innovative ways of using everything from words to sentences to interactions in a more sort of communicative, pragmatic level. Let's look at the examples. You know, pinch in English means this, right? But in my household, where we also say pinchar, pinch means stab, right? Don't pinch me is don't stab me, right? And I don't know if that makes intuitive sense to any of you. You might say, God, that's not my dialect, but this is an example of a word that has acquired a lexical meaning from the other language, right?
It could be a curse word.
Oh God, can it?
Pinche.
Well, pinche, yes, of course.
Can you
But
repeat what she said so we can all hear?
oh, sorry. So the comment is, of course, pinche can be a curse word. Yes. For me, pinchar means to stab. And
When you say for you, meaning
in Spanish, in my version of
Spain.
Spanish, pinchar means to stab.
and in what's
And
your
actually-
version of Spanish?
And my dialect doesn't use pinche so much, but that's okay.
Well, it's
I use other words. I'm not going to say them.
well, Puerto Rican, it's not something we use in Puerto Rico, but it is something that we use it is used
Exactly.
in Mexican Spanish, I would say.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and we hear it in our community, right? Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, that's a good. I think the next time I present this, I'll have to come up with a different example. So don't put me in the complicated position of having to curse.
Interesting twist.
I know it's an awesome twist. I really like it. So but I hope that you see where I'm getting at, and I bet you can find a lot of other examples from your bilingual selves where you're taking a word, you're kind of changing the meaning of it based on your other language, right? The examples here, actually, this is such a fun website. This is the speech accent repository. I forget what they call it. The speech accent archive, right? And this has been around for decades now, it feels like. They get, I think it's like several hundred people from all over the world to read the same sentence. It's a sentence that the same sentence, the same passage. Let's see. Can you all online still see this? So different speakers reading, please call Stella, ask her to bring these things with her from the store, blah, blah, blah. You go to the speech accent archive and you listen to the different speakers. And again, there's a lot of them, right? With from a lot of languages. What you wind up, it's a fun exercise to try to show, to have someone listen to these speakers and guess where they're from. Because the way that they speak totally betrays where they're from. Sometimes, right? This is like, people often could tell where my mother was from, right? And you all have had those experiences too, right? Somebody who speaks accented English. And what we're seeing there is really phonological innovation, phonological transfer, right? The phonology from one language is kind of simmering around the phonology of the other. And it's cool stuff. A syntactic example is she washes the hands. I mean, in Spanish, se lava las manos, las is the, right? And the person that says it this way, he was laughing in his fist. I think in English, the expression might be laugh up your sleeve. And I don't know, I don't know if we have a German speaker in the audience who can verify or not. If you laugh in do you laugh in your fist in German? Maybe it's a Dutch example, but what's that? It is, it's German. And so the idea is that you're taking this German phrase and you're adapting it in the new language. It's novel, it can be really cool. And it can actually be a way to signal, hey, I'm a bilingual, I speak these two languages. I love this one. In German, somebody says danke and you say bitte, right? If you say that in English, you're doing something that's pragmatically coming from German. Because you don't usually respond with a please in English, right? And then some kind of really fun ones. I love asparagus because this is maybe the Spanish speaker who is hypercorrecting and is saying asparagus. I've heard this so much. In Zacatines, I love this one too. It's the fun combination. This was created by my children so many years ago. It's the combination of socks and calcetines. Calcetines are socks in Spanish. Isn't that wonderful? Notice how it doesn't violate any of the morphological rules of either language. How clever those kids were when they were ever so tiny, right? And bilingual kids do stuff like this all the time, right? So these are some fun examples. Some of the work I mentioned before, that the most sort of recent dabbling in linguistics that I've done is a project on innovations, where we were very interested in asking this question. When a bilingual has two languages in their same mind, there's integration. We know from a lot of research that the vocabulary is really integrated. So in fact, those of you who are teaching and are thinking, how do I teach vocabulary? Imagine that vocabulary you're teaching in an L2, in a second language, is going to be living, coexisting with the vocabulary of the L1. The representations are so tightly woven together. And there's a ton of research about that I'm not going to talk about at all. Another one is when your first language, which is stronger, mediates your knowledge in the second language, right? This is where a lot of the early literature on innovations was very focused on what they called interference, because it's like your L1 is getting in the way, right? And there's a lot of research on this. There's a lot of interesting models of why that is and at the different levels of analysis. What my colleagues and I were interested in was, well, what if we said that it didn't matter? And what if it could also, if the interference, if you will, could also come from your weaker language? So we did this study with bilinguals who were speakers of Brazilian Portuguese and English. I gave you the examples in Spanish and English because I figured there'd probably be more speakers of Spanish in the room than of Brazilian Portuguese, but really the idea is this. You've got these verbs like marchar and march, okay? Which kind of operate differently in English and Spanish. So, and this is, so, you have this way of expressing the sense of this sentence using to make someone to march, right? Hacer marchar is what we're doing in Spanish. Notice that in English, you can simply say the general marched his soldiers along the avenue. But those of you who speak Spanish, tell me what your intuitions are about this other sentence. El general marchó a sus soldados por la avenida. Does that sound like an awesome Spanish sentence, or is it a little bit cringe?
We do have some teachers in the room and some very adult speakers who were educated in Spanish in their home countries. So any reactions for those of you who? Yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound grammatically correct, but it's something that I can understand. Like if somebody says it to me, I know what they're saying.
And which sentence are you referring to?
This one, right?
Correct.
El general marchó a los soldados por la avenida, right?
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah, like definitely, no, I would not write in a formal paper, right? No.
like it's missing something.
Right, exactly. Would you write it in an email?
Maybe not in an email,
But in a text message?
to my friend, yeah.
Awesome. Okay,
So-
okay. Now we're getting, that's the intuition that we were so intrigued with, right? When we started studying this. And what we discovered is that monolingual speakers of Spanish hate this sentence. They say it's bad, and we have a whole bunch of different techniques that show that it takes them longer to read it. If you ask them a question about it afterwards, they get the question wrong. All sorts of things go wrong in the processing when it's this sentence. I don't recall if we used RSVP with them, that technique from before. But you know, if you did an RSVP task and you compared this sentence to that sentence, the Spanish monolingual speakers would be thrown off by this sentence. But the Spanish bilingual speakers, they were fine with these sentences. They process them like no problem. You know, we can take it. And in fact, we saw that that you didn't need to be an English dominant bilingual to experience this effect. Spanish dominant bilinguals did too, right? And so what we were then very interested in trying to argue is that, you know, maybe it looks like you have this, I don't know, minor slip because English is interfering in your Spanish. Maybe what it is that the exposure to both languages is reorganizing the grammar in your first language. And we thought that that was a cool finding. I don't know. I thought that was interesting, right? And I see maybe some consensus. Hard to tell. Let's see. Just a couple more slides and then I'm done, I promise. A couple of things about learning languages. I didn't want to talk too much about this, but maybe you'll have questions about it. I don't know. When you learn a first language, gosh, we tend to think of that as being so effortless and happening so quickly. The truth of the matter is that children take a long time to reach an adult-like state in their grammar. So don't let anyone deceive you in telling you that infants are so good at language learning. It takes a while, right? Especially when you ask about things like in Spanish, it takes people so long to really exhibit a command of the subjunctive, right? For instance, if you speak Spanish, you know what I mean. In English, it takes people a long time to get things like pronominal reference, right? So what pronouns refer to. You hear kids that are like in elementary school and they're saying things like, and he went into the room and then he kicked him and he did that to him and then he did, and they're not really telling you, like, you go, who's doing what? So these are things that get learned really, really late. This is a long way of introducing, what about when you're learning a second language? And in fact, I think it's one of the most like deep questions. Can you learn a language after a certain age? Is there such a thing as after age 12 or after age 3 that you're not going to be a perfect learner of language? In fact, the evidence is so messy, really, really so messy. And a lot of variables make a difference in how well and how fast you learn something. Age of acquisition, for sure, being one of the primary variables. These are some graphs from an old study I would love to see replicated. I was trying to see if somebody's replicated it since as far away as 2003. The US Census, if you've ever answered it, it asks you, do you speak English and how well do you speak it, right? Or questions like that. And so this is capturing the data for native Chinese speakers and native Spanish speakers by age of immigration. And what we're showing here is the English proficiency on the 4-point scale that the census asks the information. The different lines, I don't know how well you can see them. Top line is people with a college degree, high school graduates, people with some high school, people with less than 8 years of education, and people with less than 5 years of education. And what we see is that definitely age of acquisition seems to matter quite a bit, right? The older that you are when you first immigrate to the United States, the lower your English proficiency is. But notice also the kind of really sizable effect of education, right? Not insignificant, it looks like, and very similar between these two pretty different languages and pretty different immigrant communities, right? Other variables that people have studied are on the left side of the screen, and gosh, there's, again, a lot of work on all of these, and sometimes I feel like all that research can be so inconclusive, but it's so interesting. And I hope that it's part of a lot of the work that you're doing in your own courses. So last thing that I'll talk about is what the US Secretary of Education is going around giving speeches talking about bilingual superpowers. He's such a cool guy. If you don't know about him, look him up. You have to look him up. You're educators. You need to know who he is. What are these bilingual superpowers? I've told you about, the ability that all users of language have to make infinitely long sentences, right? And change people's mental states. When you're bilingual, something about the fact that you're using two languages actively all the time and they're coexisting in your head gives you some interesting, I guess has some long stream benefits on a number of areas. So for one, the fact that you're spending your entire life distinguishing between two languages, according to some studies, gives you a very strong executive function. If you're better able to focus because you're bilingual, I think that's a pretty cool side effect. In some studies, they show that there's a delay in the onset of Alzheimer's for people who are bilingual compared to their monolingual counterparts. Some work on bilinguals having stronger problem-solving skills, stronger cognitive flexibility, right? And bilinguals being much more attuned to ambiguity. Think about this, if you're occupying two languages, you need to tolerate the fact that sometimes things may not mean what they seem, right? I mean, if you're, I should have written out a good example for this, and I can't think of one right now. Yes, I can think of kind of one. Sabor Original, which was written on a toothpaste tube that I saw sometime in the Upper West Side, I think it was. And I'm saying, Saber Original, this is ungrammatical. Saber Original, I was having a bilingual kind of moment. I could understand it, but I couldn't because I was using the wrong language to interpret. Maybe not the best example, so I apologize for that. We're getting into the depths of the presentation. The last thing, really cool work on how bilinguals are able to suspend the mutual exclusivity principle. But you know what? I'm not going to go over this. If you really want to know what this is, you can let me know. This is actually one of those principles that little kids use to learn vocabulary really fast. And if you have a question about it, maybe we'll take it, but let's not talk about it now. That's it for me. I want to remind you that, you're working in multilingual classrooms, and it is your responsibility to really, really treasure the incredible the wonderful capital that students come to your classroom with in terms of their linguistic heritage and their cultural heritage. So I really want to encourage you to think about that in your own classrooms with your own friends, and even in the classrooms that you're experiencing at Mercy. I think this is something we don't take enough time to think about. And I think that's what I want to leave you with. So if the QR code isn't working, that link should be working. Make sure that you use the S. If you don't include HTTPS, it goes berserk somehow. I don't know. And I wonder if there are questions.
Well, I think a great idea would be to bounce from one question in person to one question online. I'm going to let my colleagues think about how to get that going. Do we have any questions in person? Yes. Yes.
So I would like to know.
Excuse me, Vicky, can we go back to the screen?
Oh,
Not quite yet. Could we wait just like 2 minutes? Is that okay?
Sure.
How did you become involved with the field of psycholinguistics, and who was an influence for you?
a great question. So when I started graduate school, I had done an undergraduate degree in linguistics. I studied German also. I was very interested in very formal aspects of language. I think I wanted to be in syntax, and so I know, right? I know. And I had an amazing mentor when I started graduate school. I was assigned to a woman named Helen Cairns. She's the person that I co-authored textbook with and that handbook of psycholinguistics. She's the most amazing person actually in terms of, she sat me down and she said, you're interested in bilinguals and you want to study them, you got to take classes in psycholinguistics. And I was like, what's that? What's psycholinguistics? And so she connected me with some of the psycholinguists in the program, and the rest was history. I mean, it opened up my mind. I was no longer as interested in syntax. I got more interested in phonology. But then, I discovered this syntactic ambiguity that bilinguals people were saying they were processing it differently as opposed to monolingual, and that, like, the rest is history. So
Yeah.
Helen Cairns, she walks on water.
So Eileen, do
Yes.
you want to field a question from online?
Yes, but again, we still have the screen if that's able to.
We can take the screen off if that works.
That would be great.
great.
Okay. So I think I'm going to see, because I can't see the people on.
Can you see the question PowerPoint over here?
Yes, that's what I was going to ask, the number 21. But do
Okay.
feel free, anybody online, please enter any questions on the chat because we'll be monitoring.
I'm sorry, Eileen. I have seen that Tareen Malcolm is raising her hand. Could we get
Yes,
a response
yes.
from her? Okay.
Hi, sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fernandez, for a wonderful talk. I actually can't see you. Oh, now I can see you. I did have a question, or this is very like a linguistics conference question. I have a comment and a question. This is actually
Love to do that.
so I really enjoyed your talk about interference and transfer and all the interesting constructions. But I'm curious about your thoughts about the move in the field to move away from terms like code switching and code mixing and move more towards words like translanguaging, like Ophelia Garcia has talked about, and the embodiment of being a bilingual, and how when we think about students who are bilingual, particularly I think on the college level, are we penalizing them for these normal bilingual constructions that are very normal for a bilingual speaker to make, but aren't technically within what some would call, and I hate this word, the standard, right, English? And how are we thinking about unlearning that sort of unconscious bias? I know I do this work in a bilingualism course that we teach in the summer in the CD program, but it takes a lot of work that seems to be ongoing to unlearn this colonial perspective of language and what that means across all languages and not just European languages. So I love to know your thoughts on that.
I love your question, and it gives me the opportunity to get on my soapbox and say that of all of the biases that we've eliminated in my lifetime, biases against non-standard, if you will, language use are still so persistent. I did not say before that I said that language is not speech, language is not the idea, language is not communication. Also, language is not intelligence. And there are many examples of how you can dissociate. A person can speak very fluently and have and be limited otherwise in terms of certain measures of intelligence. So I think I would say how can we as a society need to do so much work to help people overcome these biases. I think that our classrooms are an important space to do that, but as is everywhere where you're encountering people in multilingual spaces. And we certainly need to get over the fact that, again, if you're not a native speaker of a language, it should not matter, right? And if you speak with an accent, we should take that as a cherished and interesting aspect of who you are, rather than as an index of something else. Now, of course, language is such an index of identity that it quite often is tied to sociodemographic variables, right? I mean, one of my favorite examples of that is when I was riding the train with my children and I was speaking Spanish to them. They were speaking English back to me because for a while my children were such brats that they didn't want to become bilingual. And as a woman, as she was getting off the train, I believe it might have been Chappaqua, she said, "I really would love for you to be my children's babysitter." I'm their mother, So what is going on that you're associating Spanish with babysitters or something? And I mean, that's a very minor example. I'm sure that you've all suffered many more horrible injuries, actually, of people just being biased about it. And I think that we just as a society need to have a moment and really work to fix that. And I would welcome thinking with you, how can Mercy University become a more linguistically inclusive place? We have the ability to do that, right?
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And if you want to redo that 2003 study, we're ready. We can do it.
Gosh, that's awesome. Let's redo it. Yeah. I think that study has been criticized for having confounded something or other. I forget what it was. But it would be really fun to look at it now, especially now that the bilingual population in the United States is so much bigger, right? So it would be cool to try. Oh, I see that there's a comment by Natalie in the chat. Something that I learned early in my career was that linguists were really hard to understand at conferences when I went. I learned that there's the obfuscatory way of presenting hard material that goes over everybody's head. Big words, crazy, complicated sentences. And actually, I discovered that that was not going to be me as a scholar. So I offer you, I don't know, that's also, I think, if we want to make changes and get people excited about disciplines that they don't study, you can't be the the know-it-all with a large vocabulary top of the
complicated sentences,
right? Yes, that's right, and complicated sentences.
So let's bounce back into the in-person audience. Any additional questions or comments from our in-person audience? I want to see by a show of hands, who here is in Professor Raposa's class that usually is meeting at this time? So there are two of you.
Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Four. Okay, so or 4 or more, and some of you are thinking about research projects for Professor Raposa's class. And I'm wondering if anybody is thinking about any of the topics that have been talked about today, including bilingualism, executive function, use of language, difficulties with use of language. Are any of you thinking about that in terms of your research projects? And are any of you from Professor Raposa's in the school psychology program? Yes, I see heads. So tell us one or two research things you're thinking about in terms of your own research projects. How you might focus your research projects. Share out. So Dr. Fernandez can hear about what kinds of things you're thinking about researching.
And if you don't have ideas, join the US Census Project. I think that's a good one.
Any ideas? Yes.
Motion of awe and how it's effect on time. Ooh, so research on emotion and its effect on the perception of time. How are you going to study this? What's your methodology? Not for you.
Have
Okay,
you thought
that's great.
about like interviewing people or maybe doing a little survey?
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking about like measures and stuff. No.
Maybe a survey with
Yeah.
Yeah,
like
very cool.
non-experimental. Yeah, that's great. That's great. That's
Yeah.
often it's the gateway drug into like a much bigger and complicated study, like a dissertation. So that's fantastic. What a wonderful topic.
Maybe one other person who.
Yeah.
Yes, in the back.
Actually, not my research, but a classmate of ours. She's actually studying the correlation between bilingual students and academic success. So
That's great. So just for the microphones, the correlation between bilingual students and academic success. And what do you have any idea what the hypothesis is, or?
no, it's not my research. It's a classmate of mine, but I thought it was pretty cool.
It is very cool. And also, I don't want, we in our teacher education programs, we don't want anybody to be frightened of research or of researching just one student. It's okay if you're interested in that topic to just write up a case of one academically successful bilingual student and see what's contributing to that success. That can be super interesting. So we certainly want to encourage you all as you're thinking about your research projects to take into account bilingual anywhere. So with that said, we're going to bounce back to our online audience.
You lead me to the chameleon, and I'll see what I can do about reducing your sentence.
Oops, we're going to have somebody mute.
You're doing. There's this shifty sorcerers on the loose.
You can automatically.
But they're not here. Someone needs to protect the valley of peace.
And open changes difficult to
Come on,
enjoy.
man. Yes, that is such a satisfying thing to do. So yeah, I want to say anything.
Can we mute? I mean, I'm sorry, if we're not talking, can we mute? Thank you.
Yes, don't worry, we got that. We got it under control. So Eileen, did you have a question or are there?
Yes, I always have a question, but I just want to take a minute to say, Eva, you are just incredibly inspiring to us. I know we only have about 15 more minutes, so I want to make sure I say it. A number of us, most of our special ed program, we're all trained from Teachers College, Columbia, where we became very immersed in language courses, language development, Lois Bloom as our mentor. So this was really reminiscent and made me really missing that kind of instruction. So you really helped us with it. My question, wearing the special ed hat, and many of our professors and students here in this program, is it's a tangled web in terms of second language acquisition and new to the country and the special ed population. And for decades and decades, sometimes we get it right and sometimes it's a challenge, meaning how are kids tested here? Is it in their native language? Would they be eligible for a foreign language waiver? What does that mean? Like, why do we give the foreign language waiver? So just the nature of language development and how it may.
Dragon Warrior's work is never done.
Can you hear me, guys?
Yes, we're good.
Oh, okay. So I guess the larger question reduced to an easier question is the overlap sometimes is difficult. Is it really a disability, Or is it a student who does not have English as their native language and we're clumsy or not prepared well enough to maybe make that differentiation? Help.
Well, I mean, again, I think just like we need to get better at society, and in terms of tolerating that multilinguals just use language a little bit different than monolinguals do. I think we have to think also about things like how we test people for their knowledge. One of the great tragedies in multilingual communities and education, right? When you see that new immigrants are lagging behind, is it that we're not doing a good enough job as educators at really testing knowledge as opposed to testing, I don't know how people are interacting with the exam material. Here's something that the nurses in the audience might confirm or deny. I was sitting at a table the other day during one of our sessions, and somebody told me that the NCLEX, you can take the NCLEX in English and in French.
What's the
but you
NCLEX?
can't. The NCLEX is the exam that all nurses need to take in order to get licensed, right? You can take this exam in French, but you can't take it in Spanish, right? I bet you that if we were to do an analysis of NCLEX test takers, and would we find a correlation where the grade is depressed, the more likely that you are to be a native Spanish speaker, say? These tests are all written down. They're all questions in words, right? And so the moment that you are a little bit slower processing these words because there's the other language in your head, you are at a disadvantage. So if we want to know if the nurse is good, do we really care to test their linguistic competence, or do we want to know about how safely they are going to operate in the nursing environment? So these are challenges that we have as educators, I think.
Why don't we take one or two more questions and then we'll finish up on time.
Okay, so Eileen, we're going to bounce back into the in-person space here.
You take it.
Are there questions from the in-person space? And I was wondering would it be too hard for you to pull up your slides again? For the teacher candidates, one of our great prides is our teacher candidates all take a course on working with multilingual students. And I just wanted to have a quick point about your slides on sentences. So if you could maybe show us the slide again, that it shows the hizo marchar, that example. So some of you either teach or speak Spanish, and you can read those sentences and you can tell that perhaps there's a problem grammatically. And honestly, my level of Spanish, having grown up in the US, I would not have a problem with either of those sentences in Spanish, myself personally as a teacher. And I would suggest to those of you who may be teaching bilingual students and may be aware of nuances of grammar, that we want to support students in using the grammars that they have and not nitpick. And Yanire is one of our Spanish teachers here who can, either agree or disagree, because we support our students disagreeing. And then if you could bring up the example of the simple and the complex sentences. I was actually just talking to Yanire about this a little earlier today, and the one with the penguin chicks. So all of you who are going to be working as teachers, we'll be working with some assessment data that you get from standardized tests that all students who are learning English will do every spring in New York State. And the difference in the penguin sentences and how Dr. Fernandez was pointing out simple sentences, so that when we have lower level language learners, we accept and we celebrate a penguin chick died. That's a simple sentence. It's not that many words. We're happy. But as our language learners are moving up and in proficiency, we want them using longer, more complex sentences, especially in classrooms, and then especially on their standardized tests, because that is something that is valued, and they get rated higher And if teachers aren't giving students that feedback, and if you're studying to be a school psychologist and you're meeting with students and you're saying, wow, your English skills seem to be very good, but you're still classified as an English language learner 5 years, 6 years into your education, sometimes it's because the students aren't getting the feedback around using more complex language. And as a scholar of the sentence, I am not a scholar of the sentence, but if you would like to react to that.
I love that you're pointing this out. And I think that this is maybe something that our curricula have not incorporated enough, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know enough about the teacher ed curricula, right? But for sure, when you're teaching language, when you're teaching writing, to think about basically how words and syntax interplay and what makes a sentence easier and harder to process is something to take into account that will help people. I don't know. So for sure, exposing learners to differently graded, differently complex sentences is something to do, to develop exercises that get them playing with that complexity, right? We developed in my lab so many years ago now, it feels so quaint, this technique where we wanted to get people pronouncing complex sentences so that we were actually very interested in their prosody. So the rhythm and the intonation of their speech, we wanted to just know where they were putting pauses when they were phrasing these sentences. And we called it the New York Post to New York Times activity, where we gave them two simple sentences that they had to combine into a complex sentence. Right. So exercises like that, a penguin chick died, the chick was hand reared by zookeepers in Devon, put those two sentences together. That would be a post times kind of technique. It'd be a great way to get people exercising that recursion, right? Embedding sentences inside other sentences and getting used to complexity. And if I want you to remember one thing today is that, sentences are not just like words ordered one after the other, but they really have that syntactic structure kind of holding them together, right? The example of the sentence with the cat and the black ball, I forget what the sentence said, but I hope that convinced you enough that without syntax, you got nothing, right? So how do you work with that in your classrooms, right? And how do you think about the progression that all learners have in going from simple to complex?
So let's see if we have one more question or comment from the online audience, excuse me.
Angela, do you want to bring up yours? We have one of our professors.
Yes.
Hello.
Hi, Angela. Good to see you.
Hi. My name is Angela Cheney Grant. I teach in a nursing program, and I'm sorry to say that I wasn't able to log on until pretty much you were almost done. However, I appreciate you mentioning the fact about the NCLEX. And I'm going to tell you something. I spend a lot of time. I have bilingual students in the nursing program who a lot of times don't pass exams because of simple words that I would think they would know. And I will never forget, I had a student, just to give you an example, that took a test, one of my health assessment students a couple of semesters ago. She took a health assessment test. She got a 20 on my exam. And I'm not going to lie, I literally cried. So I walked out and I pulled her to the side and I said to her, how do you think you did on the test, my dear? She said, oh, I think I did great. And I said to her, are you taking any English, in ESL classes? She said, oh, yes, I'm still taking them. So when I went over the test with her and I read the test out to her, do you know she was able to really give me back a lot of information? So I learned so much in that experience. And I just was wondering, what are the resources that we have at Mercy, do you know, where we can reach out as instructors, and professors to actually get this help for the students?
Well, so for sure, get yourself to the teaching center and maybe talk to them about that experience and think about.
Oh, I did already. No, I did already.
That's awesome. So you're a step ahead of me already.
Oh, yeah. No, this was a couple semesters ago. So I I literally meet with my students one-on-one when I have, it's a lot, it's very tiring, but I have to say it works to really get a picture. But do we have, because this is great, I mean, hearing this, but the NCLEX is not gonna right now, it's still English and French, like you said. Is there any other resources you know of that we can tap into to help us?
I would like us to build some. I mean, I think that, CAEI has really good tutors that can work with students. They also have tutors sometimes who speak languages other than English. And so a student can sign up for a tutor that speaks their first language. So that's something for your students to know and to seek out very actively. But I think that we can probably pick it up a notch if we really incorporate some better support for English language learners, for non-native speakers of English, because I think that there's probably things that we can do to help them study better. Although I also know that whatever we're going to do for the non-native speaker is also going to help the native speaker, right? So it's going to be good for all students, right? I think that, you bring up like words that people don't know. And words in exams are just, they're almost as difficult as words in isolation, right? So in order to get people better with that, much more exposure, right? I didn't mention when I had the slide up about the variables that affect language acquisition. I mean, and I should cross all of those variables out. The most important predictor of how well you learn a language is how much you speak it, right? Like how you will play the piano better if you practice it a lot. If you're exposed to a lot of Spanish, you'll speak a lot of Spanish. If you're exposed to a lot of French, you'll speak a lot of French. So how do we get people exposed to the academic language that they're going to see on NCLEX as much as possible in as many different kinds of ways as possible? I think that's one of the challenges. But Angela, what an amazing thing that you're doing with your students.
So Eva, I think as we're bringing the program to a close, maybe if you close your screen and they can put up their closing slides. And I will say to your point here is that this is one way that we seek to expose all of you to the academic language of your disciplines. All of you will also be sitting for certification exams, and we are sincerely hoping you'll use the type of academic that we were using in tonight's presentation and in your courses as well.
Okay, I want to be on behalf of Speaker Series, thank Eva so much for being our guest. Thank Vicky for arranging this to happen, and the co-facilitators Bahar and Suda. And we just have one or two slides to say goodbye and close our hour and a half of inspiration.
Eileen, before you continue further with the suggested topics for future events, I would like to remind our audience, if you have any topics that you suggest we can cover in these speaker series, you can write in the chat area. So I will go back to the slide that I couldn't share with you earlier. And these were all the flyers that we had for the speaker series events before. So this has been Dr. Eva Fernandez's today's talk has been the 12th event. And we thank her very much for this inspiring talk. I'm sure I'm going to talk about this with my students later in our classes. And again, I want to remind, if any topics come to mind, please write in the chat area so we can consider covering it for the following semesters.
And we picked out one quote to say good night to you. And again, we are here for suggestions in the future as we're planning to end this year and begin next year with the speaker series. We thought from George Carlin, we thought this just had a sweet way of ending it, which is everyone smiles in the same language. And I thought that was a good way of just saying good night, and thank you for Eva for coming and sharing your expertise.
Thank you, everyone online.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nunez. Thank you, Dr. Fernandez. Thanks to everyone. There's a comment or no, or maybe not.
Can you touch base with me for a second? Probably not.
Okay. All right. So I close the event. If there's no other further buys, thanks everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Wednesday for 5:05 optional at 8:00 on Zoom, okay? Optional.
Yes, I'm saving the chat. I save all the records. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.